Welcome to Night Vale Whispers. I'm here to keep you company as you drift off tonight. Before we begin, like the video, subscribe, and tell me where are you watching from and what time is it. Now, get comfortable and let the stories begin. What the lake remembers. The cabin rental listing had been too good to be true. A week at Lake Willowmere for half the usual price. Available on short notice during peak summer season. The owner's email had been brief. Recent cancellation, cabin 7, end of the dock. Privacy guaranteed. You'd booked it immediately, desperate to escape the city's suffocating heat and the lingering aftermath of a relationship that had ended badly. The drive north through Wisconsin's lake country should have been relaxing. Rolling hills dotted with farms gave way to dense pine forests, and the air coming through your car windows carried the promise of cool water and quiet evenings. But as you turned onto the gravel road leading to the lake, something felt off. The trees seemed to press closer to the road than they should, their branches forming a canopy so thick it felt like driving through a tunnel. Lake Willowmere appeared suddenly through the tree line, a perfect oval of dark water surrounded by undeveloped shoreline. No motorboats carved white wakes across its surface. No children's laughter echoed from hidden beaches. Just dark, still water that reflected the overcast sky like polished obsidian. Cabin 7 sat at the end of a weathered wooden dock that extended maybe 50 feet into the lake. It was smaller than the photos had suggested, just 2 rooms and a screened porch overlooking the water. The rental company had left a welcome packet on the kitchen counter. Keys, Wi-Fi password, emergency contact numbers, and a single-page document titled Lake Willowmere Guidelines. Most of the rules were standard cabin rental fare: no loud music after 10 p.m., dispose of trash properly, report any maintenance issues. But the last item made you pause. Swimming is strongly discouraged. Lake depth varies unpredictably. Always inform someone of your location before water activities. You set the packet aside and stepped onto the screened porch. The lake stretched before you, maybe a quarter-mile across, surrounded by unbroken forest. It was exactly the kind of isolation you'd been craving, but standing there in the afternoon stillness, you felt a strange reluctance to look directly at the water for too long. Something about its perfect, mirror-like surface seemed to demand attention, while simultaneously warning you away. That first evening, you sat on the porch with a book and a glass of wine, listening to the subtle sounds of a lake at twilight. Somewhere across the water, a loon called, that haunting, almost human cry that always raised goosebumps on your arms. But when you looked up from your book to locate the bird, the lake surface was empty. Just dark water reflecting the first stars. You read until well past dark, enjoying the profound quiet that only comes with true isolation. No traffic, no sirens, no urban hum. Just the gentle lap of water against the dock posts and the occasional rustle of wind through pine needles. It was nearly midnight when you heard your name. Soft, distant, but unmistakably your name carried on the night air. You set down your book and listened intently, but heard only the usual lake sounds. Probably someone calling to a dog or a child somewhere around the lake. Sound traveled strangely over water. You'd heard that before. But as you prepared for bed, you couldn't shake the feeling that the voice had come from the water itself, rising from the lake's dark center like a question waiting to be answered. The second day dawned gray and humid, with low clouds that seemed to press down on the lake's surface. You spent the morning on the porch, working on your laptop and occasionally glancing up at the water. Several times, you could have sworn you saw movement just beneath the surface. Not fish exactly, but something larger, more purposeful. But whenever you looked directly, there was nothing but the lake's impenetrable darkness. By afternoon, Restlessness drove you to explore the shoreline. The forest came right to the water's edge in most places, creating a narrow band of marshy ground dotted with fallen logs and cattails. You found no other cabins, no boat launches, no evidence of human presence except the dock extending from your rental. Walking the perimeter took longer than expected. The lake was larger than it appeared from the cabin, and the shoreline twisted in ways that didn't match your mental map. Several times, you thought you'd completed the circuit, only to discover another inlet or cove that hadn't been visible from your starting point. It was during this walk that you found the memorial. Tucked into a grove of birch trees on the lake's far shore, a small wooden sign bore weathered text, "In memory of those claimed by Willowmere Waters." Below that, a list of names and dates spanning nearly a century. The earliest entry was from 1924, Thomas Brennan, age 19. The most recent was from just 3 years ago, Jennifer Walsh, age 34. There were too many names, far too many for a lake this remote, this small. You counted them twice, feeling increasingly unsettled. 47 people had drowned in Lake Willowmere over the past 100 years. That was nearly one death every 2 years in a body of water that appeared to have no regular visitors. The walk back to the cabin felt longer than it should have. The forest seemed denser, the shadows deeper, and more than once you had the distinct feeling of being watched, not by animals. You would have recognized that kind of attention. This felt older, more patient, like something that had learned to wait. That evening, you tried researching Lake Willowmere online, but found almost nothing. No tourism websites, no fishing reports, no historical articles. It was as if the lake existed in some bureaucratic blind spot, ignored by the digital world that had cataloged everything else. You were closing your laptop when you heard it again. Your name carried across the water in a voice that seemed to echo from multiple directions at once. This time, you didn't dismiss it as imagination. You stepped onto the porch and listened carefully, trying to locate the source. "Hello?" you called into the darkness. The lake fell silent, as if your voice had been absorbed by the water itself. No echo came back, no loon calls or night bird responses, just a silence so complete it seemed to press against your eardrums. Then, from directly beneath the dock, came the sound of something large moving through the water, not splashing, but displacing, the way a massive body might pass just below the surface, creating gentle swells that lapped against the pilings. You leaned over the porch railing, trying to see into the water, but the darkness was absolute. The moon was new, offering no illumination, and the lake had become a void that seemed to extend infinitely downward. The movement passed slowly beneath the dock, taking nearly a minute to travel from one end to the other. Whatever it was had to be enormous, larger than any fish that should inhabit a lake this size. As it passed directly under your feet, you could have sworn you felt the dock vibrate slightly, as if something had brushed against the support posts. When it was gone, the normal night sounds resumed. Insects, wind through trees, the distant hoot of an owl. But you stood on the porch for another hour, listening and watching, afraid to go inside until you were certain you were alone again. The third night, you decided to stay awake and watch. You made coffee, settled into a chair on the porch, and kept vigil over the dark water. If something was out there, if you were sharing this isolated lake with some unknown presence, you wanted to see it clearly. The calling began just after 2 a.m. Your name, spoken in a voice that was almost familiar, but not quite right, like a recording played back at the wrong speed, or a memory of someone you'd known long ago. It came from different directions each time, as if the caller was moving around the lake's perimeter. But as you listened more carefully, you realized it wasn't just one voice. It was multiple voices, all calling your name in slightly different tones and cadences. Some sounded young, others older. Some spoke with accents you couldn't place, but all of them knew exactly what to call you, spoke your name with an intimacy that made your skin crawl. You grabbed a flashlight and swept its beam across the water, but saw nothing. The voices continued, growing more insistent, overlapping until they became a chorus of your own name, echoing from every direction. That's when you noticed the lights beneath the surface. Faint, blue-green phosphorescence that pulsed in rhythm with the calling voices. Not the steady glow of bioluminescent plankton, but deliberate flashes that seemed to communicate with each other. As you watched, transfixed, the lights began to move in patterns, spirals, figure eights, complex geometries that hurt to follow with your eyes. The voices reached a crescendo, your name spoken so many times and in so many ways that it began to lose meaning, becoming just sound without sense. And then, abruptly, everything stopped. The lights vanished. The voices cut off mid-syllable. The lake returned to its mirror-perfect stillness, reflecting nothing but darkness. You sat in your chair until dawn, afraid to move, afraid to break whatever spell had been cast. As the first gray light touched the water, you could see the lake clearly for the first time since arriving. It looked exactly as it had that first afternoon, peaceful, pristine, innocent. But now you knew better. The fourth day, you tried to leave. You packed your bags, loaded the car, and drove toward the main road. But somehow, every turn led back to the lake. The gravel road that should have connected to the highway instead curved through the forest and deposited you back at the cabin. You tried different routes, consulting your phone's GPS, but the result was always the same. The roads formed a maze with only one destination. After the fifth attempt, you accepted that you weren't being allowed to leave, at least not yet. That evening, you made a decision that felt both inevitable and insane. You walked to the end of the dock and sat with your feet dangling in the water. If something in the lake knew your name, if it had been calling to you for days, then maybe it was time to answer. "I'm here," you said to the dark water. "What do you want?" The response was immediate. The water around your feet began to warm, as if something with its own heat was rising from the depths. And then the voices started again, not just your name this time, but words, sentences, fragments of conversation. "Don't leave us alone. So cold down here. Come swimming with us. The water is perfect." You understood then. The memorial you'd found, the 47 names spanning a century, they weren't victims of drowning. They were residents of the lake now. Something that had once been human but had been changed by the dark water into something else. Something that remembered being alive, remembered having names, remembered the loneliness of existence, and they wanted company. The water grew warmer around your feet, almost pleasantly so. Below the surface, those blue-green lights began to pulse again, arranging themselves in welcoming patterns. The voices became more distinct, and you began to recognize some of them from the memorial. Thomas Brennan, who spoke with the cadence of the 1920s. Jennifer Walsh, whose voice still carried traces of a Midwestern accent. They weren't malevolent, you realized. They were just lonely, trapped in the lake's depths for decades or centuries. They'd learned to call to the living, to draw new companions into their cold, dark world. Your name wasn't a threat, it was an invitation. The water reached your ankles now, though you hadn't moved deeper. The lake was rising to meet you, welcoming you home. The voices grew excited, overlapping in their eagerness to tell you about life beneath the surface, about the strange dreams that filled the endless underwater nights, about the peace of existing without the burden of breathing. You felt yourself leaning forward, drawn by the warmth and the promise of community. How long had it been since you'd felt truly welcome somewhere? How long since you'd been part of something larger than your own small, isolated existence? The water reached your knees, then your waist, rising with impossible speed. But it didn't feel like drowning. It felt like coming home. The voices sang your name now, a harmony of welcome that made your chest ache with belonging. As the dark water closed over your head, your last coherent thought was wonder at how warm it was, how right it felt to finally stop fighting and let yourself sink into the lake's embrace. You wake up changed. The cabin is gone, or perhaps you can no longer see it. Your world is now the dark water, the soft lake bed, the gentle currents that carry whispered conversations between the others who have made this place their home. You remember having another life. Remember the sun and the surface world, but those memories feel distant now, like something that happened to someone else. The others welcome you with joy. Thomas teaches you how to navigate the lake's deeper channels. Jennifer shows you the underwater garden where strange plants grow in the eternal twilight. They all share their stories, how they came to the lake, how they learned to exist in this new form, how they've maintained their community in the dark depths, and eventually, you learn to call. It takes practice to project your voice through the water and up into the air above. The first few times, you can only manage wordless sounds. But Thomas is patient, Jennifer is encouraging, and slowly you master the technique. You learn to speak names that taste like longing, to call out to the rare visitors who come to the lake seeking solitude. Most ignore the voices, dismiss them as wind or imagination, but occasionally someone listens, someone answers, someone sits on the dock with their feet in the water and asks what you want. And when they do, you tell them the truth, that you're lonely, that the lake is beautiful, that there's room for one more in your underwater community. You make the water warm and welcoming. You share the phosphorescent lights that have become your art, your poetry, your way of showing beauty in the depths. Some still resist, still fight their way back to shore, and eventually find the roads that lead away from the lake. You let them go. This isn't about force, it's about choice, about offering an alternative to the isolation that drives people to remote places like Lake Willowmere. But others, the ones who are truly alone, the ones who have nowhere to return to, they listen to your voice calling their name, and they understand the invitation for what it is. They sit on the dock as darkness falls. They let the warm water rise around them, and they choose to join your strange, eternal community. The lake remembers every name now, every voice, every story. You are part of something vast and patient and older than the forests that surround the dark water. And when the next lonely traveler arrives, seeking solitude and finding something else entirely, you'll be ready to welcome them home. After all, everyone needs somewhere to belong, even if that somewhere exists in the spaces between breathing and drowning, between the surface world and the deep places where forgotten voices learn to sing in harmony with the dark. Story 2. My son talks to someone in the closet and calls them Grandpa. Children have imaginary friends. It's normal, healthy even, according to every parenting book I'd ever read. When 4-year-old Lucas started talking to someone in his bedroom closet, I wasn't concerned. If anything, I was relieved. We'd moved to the new house 3 months earlier, and he'd been having trouble adjusting night terrors, clinging to me during the day, refusing to play alone in his room. The imaginary friend seemed to help. He'd spend hours in his bedroom, carrying on elaborate conversations with someone he called Grandpa. I'd hear him through the door, his high voice chattering away, occasionally pausing as if listening to responses I couldn't hear. Grandpa says the house is very old, he told me one afternoon over juice and crackers. He says he likes my room the best because it gets good light in the morning. I smiled and played along. That's nice, sweetie. What else does Grandpa say? He says you picked a good house, but you should fix the step by the back door before someone gets hurt. Lucas took a bite of his crackers, matter of fact. He says the last people who lived here never fixed anything. The comment about the back step gave me pause. There was indeed a loose board that I'd been meaning to repair, but I was certain I'd never mentioned it to Lucas. Still, he was an observant child. He'd probably noticed me testing the step with my foot when we carried groceries in. The conversations continued for weeks. Lucas would disappear into his room after dinner, emerging an hour later with stories about what Grandpa had told him. Most of it was innocent enough observations about the weather, questions about Lucas's day at preschool, gentle advice about sharing toys and eating vegetables. But some of the details bothered me. Grandpa says the apple tree in the backyard used to have a swing. Lucas announced one morning while I made breakfast. He says his little girl loved that swing, but they had to take it down when the rope got old. I looked out the kitchen window at the gnarled apple tree that dominated our small backyard. There was indeed a thick branch that showed signs of wear, a groove worn smooth by what could have been an old rope. But how would Lucas know that? The realtor had never mentioned a swing, and there was no evidence of one when we'd moved in. What else does Grandpa tell you about his little girl? I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. She had my room, Lucas said, climbing onto his booster seat. Grandpa says she liked to put her dollhouse right where my toy box is now. He says she'd play there for hours, making up stories about the tiny people. That evening, after Lucas was asleep, I did some research on the house. The property records showed it had been built in 1952 and had only 3 previous owners. The family who'd lived there longest from 1963 to 2019 was named Morrison, Robert and Helen Morrison, with one daughter, Sarah. I found Sarah Morrison's obituary in the local newspaper archives. She died in 1971 at age 7 after a brief illness. The obituary mentioned that she was survived by her parents and that she loved dolls and playing in the apple tree swing her father had built for her. My hands shook as I closed the laptop. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe the neighbors had mentioned the Morrison family. Maybe there were old photographs somewhere in the house that Lucas had found. Children were naturally curious, and he could have pieced together the story from various sources. But that night, I heard something that made my rational explanations crumble. I was lying in bed around midnight when voices drifted through the thin walls from Lucas's room. His childish chatter, which I'd grown accustomed to, but underneath it, something else. Another voice, so faint I might have been imagining it, but with the cadence and timbre of an elderly man. I crept to Lucas's door and pressed my ear against the wood. The conversation was clearer here, though I still couldn't make out the other voice distinctly. It was more like hearing one side of a phone conversation, Lucas responding to someone whose words I couldn't quite catch. "Yes, Grandpa, I brushed my teeth," Lucas was saying. "Mommy made me brush twice because I had cookies after dinner." A pause. Then Lucas giggled. "No, she didn't get mad. She just said sugar bugs don't like clean teeth." Another pause, longer this time. "Grandpa, why can't Mommy hear you? She always looks confused. when I tell her what you said?" The silence that followed stretched so long I wondered if Lucas had fallen asleep. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, "Oh, because she's not ready yet." "What does that mean, not ready?" I opened the door slowly, expecting to find Lucas sitting up in bed, talking to the empty air. Instead, he was fast asleep, curled on his side with his favorite stuffed elephant tucked under his arm. The closet door, which I always left slightly ajar for the nightlight, was closed. I approached it carefully, my heart hammering against my ribs. The old brass knob was cold under my palm, and when I turned it, the hinges creaked softly. Inside was exactly what should be there. Lucas's clothes hanging in neat rows, his shoes lined up on the floor, a few storage boxes on the upper shelf. But the air inside felt different, warmer, somehow, and with the faintest scent of pipe tobacco and Old Spice aftershave. The next morning, Lucas seemed unusually quiet during breakfast. He picked at his cereal, lost in thought, until finally he looked up at me with serious eyes. "Grandpa says you were listening last night." I nearly choked on my coffee. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "He says you heard us talking. He says that's good, because it means you might be getting ready too." "Ready for what?" Lucas shrugged. "He didn't say, but he wants to meet you properly. He says you seem like a nice mom, and he's sorry if he scared you." That afternoon, while Lucas napped, I called the previous homeowner, Mrs. Patterson, whose number I'd kept from the closing paperwork. After some small talk, I worked up the courage to ask about the Morrisons. "Oh, you found out about them," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "Robert was such a sweet man. Still lived here when we bought the place in '92. Helen had passed a few years earlier, and he was rattling around in that big house all alone." "What happened to him?" "Heart attack in '96. Found him in his daughter's old room, sitting in the rocking chair by the closet. That's where he always went when he missed her most." Mrs. Patterson paused. "He used to talk to her, you know. Said he could feel her there sometimes, especially in the evenings. I thought it was just grief, but what?" "Well, strange things happened after he died. Little things, toys being moved, doors opening and closing. The family who bought it from his estate never could settle in. Moved out after 6 months. Said the house felt crowded. Same thing happened with the next family." My mouth went dry. "How many families lived there before us?" "4, including us. None stayed longer than 2 years. Most said the house felt occupied, especially the children's bedrooms." That evening, I sat in Lucas's room after his bedtime story, ostensibly organizing his bookshelf but really working up the courage to speak to empty air. "If someone is there," I said quietly, feeling foolish but determined, "I need you to know that Lucas is my son, and his safety comes first. I don't know what you want, but—" "Mommy?" Lucas's sleepy voice interrupted me. "Grandpa wants to talk to you." I turned to find my son sitting up in bed, his eyes unusually bright in the dim light from the hallway. "He says he doesn't want to hurt anyone," Lucas continued in that strange, dreamy voice. "He says he just gets lonely sometimes, and kids are easier to talk to because they don't think so hard about what's possible." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. I pulled Lucas's blanket higher around his shoulders, but he didn't seem cold. "He says his name is Robert Morrison, and this used to be his house. He says he's been watching over it since he died, making sure the right family moved in." "The right family?" Lucas nodded solemnly. "He says most people who live here don't understand that some places hold memories, and some memories don't want to let go. But he likes us because we're kind to the house, and because I remind him of Sarah." Tears pricked my eyes. "What happened to Sarah?" "She got sick," Lucas said simply. "But Grandpa says she's not here anymore." She went where she was supposed to go. He's the one who stayed behind. Why? Lucas was quiet for a long moment, his small face scrunched in concentration. He says he made a promise to keep the house safe, to make sure only good families lived here. He says he's tired, but he doesn't know how to leave. I look toward the closet, its door slightly ajar again despite my closing it earlier. What does he need? He wants to know you won't be afraid of him, Lucas said. He wants to know it's okay for him to be here, just for a little while longer, until he figures out how to say goodbye. I thought about all the families who'd fled this house, all the children who'd been frightened by a presence they couldn't understand. But Lucas wasn't frightened. If anything, he seemed comforted by his conversations with the invisible grandfather who watched over our home. Tell him, I said softly. Tell him he can stay as long as he needs to, but I want him to know that this is Lucas's room now, and Lucas's safety comes first. Lucas smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him since we'd moved in. Grandpa says thank you. He says he'll be very careful, and he promises he won't do anything to scare you. Can you ask him something for me? Lucas nodded. Ask him if he knows why the house chose us. Another long pause, then Lucas giggled. Grandpa says the house didn't choose us. He did. He says he watched you the day you came to look at the house, and he saw how you made sure to check that all the windows in my room opened properly, in case there was ever a fire. He says parents who think about keeping their children safe are the right kind of parents for his house. That night, I lay in bed listening to the familiar sounds of our home settling around us. But now, instead of feeling alone in a big, empty house, I felt watched over, protected, even by someone who understood what it meant to love a child so much you'd refuse to leave them, even after death claimed you. Lucas still talks to Grandpa most evenings, though less frequently now. Sometimes I hear them discussing the weather or laughing over some joke I can't catch. Other times, the house is simply quiet, filled with the peaceful presence of a guardian who's learning, slowly, how to let go. I haven't seen Robert Morrison yet, but sometimes I catch that scent of pipe tobacco and Old Spice, and I know he's there, watching over us, keeping us safe, until the day he finds the strength to join his daughter wherever she's waiting for him. Some houses hold memories. Some memories refuse to let go, but sometimes that's exactly what a family needs: a grandfather's love that transcends death, ensuring that the right people find their way home. Story 3. There's a house at the end of our street that everyone pretends isn't there. Moving to Willowbrook Lane felt like stepping into one of those suburban fairy tales where nothing bad ever happened. The kind of street where kids ride bikes until the streetlights come on and neighbors wave from perfectly manicured lawns. Red brick colonials and white picket fences stretched in neat rows, each house a minor variation on the American dream theme. The realtor had called it an established family neighborhood, which I'd assumed meant good schools and low crime rates. I didn't notice the gap in the house numbers until my third week there. Our address was 1247, a tidy two-story with blue shutters and a maple tree that would be gorgeous in October. The house to our left was 1245, occupied by the Hendersons, who'd brought over a casserole and stayed for an hour, sharing neighborhood gossip. To our right lived the Kowalskis at 1249, a retired couple who kept the most pristine garden I'd ever seen. But there was no 1247 on the other side of the street. The numbers jumped from 1246 to 1250. As if whoever had laid out the subdivision had simply forgotten that odd numbers existed for a moment. I might not have noticed at all if I hadn't been waiting for a package delivery and gotten confused about which house the driver was looking for. "Excuse me," I called to Mrs. Chen, who was collecting her mail from the box marked 1246. I'm trying to find 1248. The delivery tracker says it was left there, but I don't see. She looked at me with the kind of blank expression people get when you ask them a question in a language they don't speak. There's no 1248, she said after a long pause. Never has been. I pointed across the street to where there was clearly a house sitting between 1246 and 1250. It was smaller than the others, probably built in the 1950s, with weathered siding that might have once been yellow and a front porch that sagged slightly on one side. The lawn was overgrown, and newspapers were scattered across the walkway like fallen leaves. Mrs. Chen followed my gaze, and something flickered across her face, not confusion, but something more deliberate, more careful. I don't know what you're pointing at, she said, then hurried inside with her mail clutched against her chest. That evening, I mentioned the odd numbering to my neighbor Jim Henderson while we were both taking out trash cans. The house across from the Chens, I said, between 1246 and 1250. It looks abandoned, but there's no address marker. Do you know who owns it? Jim's face went through the same careful transformation I'd seen on Mrs. Chen's. The friendly, neighborly expression smoothed into something neutral and distant. There's nothing between the Chens and the Parkers, he said, just their property lines. I stared at him. The house was right there, clearly visible in the glow of the streetlight. Paint peeling from its shutters, a front window that reflected the street like a dead eye. Jim, it's right. I should get inside, he said, already turning away. Karen's making pot roast. Over the next few days, I tested the phenomenon with other neighbors. The mailman, a cheerful guy named Dave who'd been delivering on Willowbrook Lane for 15 years, insisted he'd never seen any house that matched my description. The Kowalskis claimed there was nothing but a drainage easement between the Chens and the Parkers. Even the teenagers who skateboarded past every afternoon seemed to navigate around an obstacle that they never acknowledged existed. But I could see it. Every morning when I left for work, every evening when I came home. A small, deteriorating house with no address, no mailbox, no visible signs of life. And yet somehow, despite its obvious abandonment, it never seemed to get any worse. The grass stayed at exactly the same height of overgrown. The newspapers on the walkway never increased in number, never yellowed in the sun. I started taking pictures, thinking I could show the neighbors proof of what they were missing. But the photographs came out strange. The house appeared as a sort of blurred smudge, like something moving too fast for the camera to capture. In some shots, it looked almost transparent, as if the image of the street behind it was bleeding through. 3 weeks after I'd first noticed the numbering gap, I decided to walk up to the house directly. If no one would acknowledge it existed, maybe I could find some clue about why it had been erased from the neighborhood's collective memory. The front yard felt different as soon as I stepped onto what should have been the property line. The air was thicker somehow, and sounds seemed muffled, the distant hum of traffic, the neighbor's lawnmower. Even my own footsteps became distant and dreamlike. The newspapers on the walkway were dated from the previous month, but they looked fresh, as if they'd been delivered that morning. The front door was painted a deep red that seemed too vivid compared to the faded siding around it. There was no doorbell, no knocker, just a brass mail slot that gleamed like it had been recently polished. I pressed my ear to the door and heard something that made my skin crawl, the sound of normal family life. Muffled voices, the clink of dishes, a television playing what sounded like an old sitcom with a laugh track. Someone was living there. I knocked. 3 soft raps, that seemed to echo longer than they should have. The sounds inside stopped immediately, as if someone had hit a pause button on the domestic scene. Then, after what felt like several minutes, footsteps approached the door. "Hello?" The voice was female, middle-aged, with the kind of careful politeness people use when talking to strangers. "Can I help you?" "I'm sorry to bother you," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure why I was apologizing. "I'm your new neighbor from across the street. I just wanted to introduce myself." A long silence, then, "I'm afraid there's been some mistake. We don't have any neighbors across the street." I looked over my shoulder at my own house, clearly visible with its blue shutters and the maple tree I'd been admiring since we moved in. "I live at 1247, I said, "the blue house with the maple tree." "There's no house there," the woman said, and I could hear the smile in her voice, the kind of patient tone you'd use with a confused child. "There's never been a house there." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with each of us insisting that the other's home didn't exist. Through the door, I could hear what sounded like a family continuing their evening, children asking questions, a man reading newspaper headlines aloud, the scrape of chairs around a dinner table. Normal sounds from a normal family who lived in a house that an entire neighborhood refused to acknowledge. When I finally walked back to my own supposedly non-existent home, I felt watched. Not malevolently, but with the intense attention of people trying to understand something that defied explanation. I didn't look back at the house until I was safely inside my own front door, and when I did, I saw a woman's silhouette in the front window, motionless as a mannequin. The next morning, I called the city planning office to inquire about the property. The clerk was helpful and efficient, pulling up records for every address on Willowbrook Lane. According to the official documentation, there was no lot between 1,246 and 1,250. The property lines showed the Chen's backyard extending directly to the Parkers' side fence. "But I'm looking at a house right now," I insisted, standing in my front yard with my phone pressed to my ear. "It's physically there." "Sir, I'm looking at satellite imagery from last month. There's no structure at that location." I asked her to email me the satellite photos. In the images, Willowbrook Lane appeared exactly as she'd described, an unbroken line of houses with normal spacing between them. Where the mysterious house should have been, there was only grass and a few trees. But I could see it. Right there, 20 feet away from where I stood, a small house with weathered siding and a red front door, as solid and real as anything else on the street. The breaking point came during the neighborhood block party in mid-October. The entire street had turned out for hamburgers and potato salad, kids running between the adults with paper plates and juice boxes. I'd been living on Willowbrook Lane for 2 months by then, and I'd started to feel like I was losing my grip on reality. Either everyone else was participating in an elaborate conspiracy, or I was having some kind of breakdown that caused me to see houses that didn't exist. I decided to force the issue. "Has anyone seen the family that lives in the house across from the Chens?" I announced during a lull in conversation. I've been trying to introduce myself, but they seem pretty private. The effect was immediate and unsettling. Every conversation stopped. Adults froze with drinks halfway to their lips. Children paused in their games and turned to stare at me with expressions that seemed far too serious for their ages. "What house?" asked Karen Henderson, but her voice had the same careful quality I'd heard from everyone else when the subject came up. I pointed directly at it. The house was clearly visible, its front porch light glowing warmly in the early evening darkness. Through the windows, I could see the flicker of what looked like a television screen. "That house," I said, "right there." The silence stretched uncomfortably long. Then, one by one, Every person at the block party turned to look where I was pointing, but their eyes didn't focus. They looked through the space, around it, as if their vision simply couldn't process what was there. "I think you might be confused," said Mr. Kowalski gently. "There's nothing there but trees." That's when I noticed something that made my chest tighten with fear. While all the adults were carefully not seeing the house, the children were staring directly at it. Their expressions weren't confused or careful, they were terrified. 8-year-old Emma Chen was gripping her mother's hand so tightly her knuckles had gone white. The teenage Parker boy had gone pale and taken several steps backward. Even the toddlers seemed to sense something wrong, pressing closer to their parents with worried whimpers. The children could see it, but somehow the adults had learned not to. "I think I should go inside," I said, my voice coming out smaller than I'd intended. As I walked back toward my house, I heard Mrs. Henderson stage whisper to her husband, "How long do you think before they stop seeing it?" "Took us about 6 months," he whispered back. "Once you understand what it costs to keep looking, you learn to look away." I spent that night sitting by my front window, staring at the house across the street and trying to understand what was happening to me or to the neighborhood, or to the boundaries between what was real and what was possible. The family inside seemed to be having a normal evening, lights moving from room to room, the blue glow of television in what looked like a living room. Around midnight, I saw the woman I'd spoken to through the door. She was standing in her front yard, looking directly at my house with the same intensity I'd been directing at hers. We watched each other across the impossible distance between a house that existed and a house that didn't. Two people trying to make sense of a reality that refused to make sense. She raised her hand in a small wave. After a moment's hesitation, I waved back. The next morning, I called a realtor about putting my house on the market. When she came by for the evaluation, I didn't mention the house across the street, and neither did she. According to her, the view from my front window showed a lovely grove of oak trees that would provide beautiful shade in the summer. I moved out 6 weeks later. The last thing I saw as the moving truck pulled away was a child's face in the window of the house that didn't exist, watching me leave with an expression of infinite sadness. My new apartment is in a high-rise downtown, surrounded by concrete and steel and things that are definitively real or definitively not real. But sometimes, late at night, I find myself wondering about the family in that impossible house, and about all the children on Willowbrook Lane who will eventually learn to stop seeing what's there. I wonder if forgetting is a choice we make, or something that happens to us whether we want it or not. I wonder if there are other streets in other towns where houses exist in the spaces between what's possible and what's convenient to believe. Most of all, I wonder if the woman with the careful, polite voice ever found her way back to a world where her house had an address, where her neighbors could see her children playing in a yard that appeared on satellite photos. But I never went back to find out. Some questions are too dangerous to answer, and some kinds of seeing are too costly to maintain. The children on Willowbrook Lane will understand that eventually. They always do. Story 4. The Cleaning Lady. The job listing was simple enough. Housekeeping position, remote estate, room and board provided, must be comfortable with solitude. References required. After 3 months of unemployment and an eviction notice pinned to my apartment door, comfortable with solitude wasn't a preference, it was a necessity. The estate sat 40 minutes outside Burlington, Vermont, down a winding dirt road that carved through dense maple and birch forests. The GPS signal died about halfway there, but the handwritten directions Mrs. Whitmore had mailed were precise. Turn left at the lightning split oak, right at the stone wall covered in Virginia creeper, straight until you see the iron gates. The house emerged from the tree line like something from another century, 3 stories of weathered clapboard siding and black shutters, with a wraparound porch that sagged slightly on the eastern side. Victorian, maybe, or early colonial, the kind of place that had probably housed generations of the same family until they'd either died off or moved somewhere with better cell service. Mrs. Whitmore met me at the front door. She was exactly what I'd imagined from our brief phone conversation. Silver-haired, probably in her 70s, wearing a cardigan despite the September heat. Her handshake was firm, her smile genuine but tired. "You found it all right," she said, taking my single suitcase. "Good. Some people get turned around on those back roads." She led me through rooms that smelled of lemon oil and something else, something sweet and slightly stale, like flowers left too long in water. The furniture was antique but well maintained, all dark wood and faded upholstery. Family photographs lined the mantelpiece and side tables, but I didn't study them closely. Mrs. Whitmore had that brittle quality of someone who'd recently lost someone important, and I'd learned not to pry into other people's grief. "The position is straightforward," she explained as we climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor. "General housekeeping, some light cooking. I spend most of my time in the library or the garden, so you'll have plenty of privacy. Your room is here." She opened a door to reveal a small but comfortable bedroom with slanted ceilings and a window that looked out over the forest. The walls were painted a soft yellow, and there was a writing desk tucked under the eaves. "Meals at 7 and 6, if that suits you. I'm not particular about much else." She paused at the threshold. "There is one thing, though. The room at the end of the hall." She gestured toward a door, painted the same white as all the others. "That one stays locked. It's just storage now, old furniture and such, but the floor isn't safe, rotted through in places." I nodded. Every old house had a room like that. The first week passed without incident. Mrs. Whitmore kept to herself, as promised, emerging only for meals where she made polite conversation about the weather or the changing leaves. The work was easy: dusting, vacuuming, preparing simple dinners of soup and sandwiches. The isolation didn't bother me. If anything, it was a relief after months of job interviews and awkward conversations with potential roommates. But old houses have their own language, and by the second week, I was starting to learn this one's vocabulary. The way the pipes sang in the walls when the water pressure changed, the soft groan of floorboards settling in the evening cool, the whisper of wind through gaps in the window frames, and something else. It started as a feeling more than a sound, a sense that I wasn't quite alone when I was cleaning the upstairs rooms. Nothing dramatic, just the prickle of awareness you get when someone's watching you from across a crowded room. I'd turn, expecting to see Mrs. Whitmore checking on my work, but the hallway would be empty. The locked room sat at the end of the hall like a patient thing. I passed it dozens of times each day, and gradually I began to notice details. The door wasn't quite flush with the frame. There was a gap at the bottom, maybe an inch wide. Sometimes when I was cleaning the nearby bathroom or changing the sheets in the guest bedroom, I'd catch a glimpse of movement in that gap. Just a shift in the shadows, the kind of thing that could easily be a mouse or the play of afternoon light through dusty windows. But mice don't sigh. I heard it clearly on a Thursday afternoon while I was vacuuming the hallway runner. A soft, almost inaudible exhale that seemed to come from just beyond the locked door. I switched off the vacuum and listened, but there was only the usual settling and creaking. That evening, over dinner, I mentioned it to Mrs. Whitmore. "Oh, that," she said, not looking up from her soup. "It's the house. Old places make all sorts of sounds. You'll get used to it." But her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass, and she excused herself early, leaving her meal half finished. The next morning, I found her in the kitchen before dawn, fully dressed and clutching a cup of coffee like a lifeline. "I've been thinking," she said without preamble. "Maybe it would be better if you cleaned the upstairs rooms in the morning. Afternoon light can play tricks, especially this time of year." I agreed, though I wasn't sure what difference it would make. But Mrs. Whitmore seemed relieved, and I was already growing fond of her quiet company. The morning cleanings were different, calmer somehow. The October sun slanted through the windows at a friendlier angle, and the sense of being watched faded to barely perceptible whispers of unease. For a few days, I almost convinced myself I'd been imagining things. Then I found the photographs. I was cleaning Mrs. Whitmore's bedroom. She'd given me permission after apologizing for the clutter when I knocked over a shoebox on her dresser. Dozens of photographs scattered across the floor, and as I gathered them up, I couldn't help but notice the faces. Mrs. Whitmore looked decades younger in most of them, her silver hair still brown, her smile brighter. But it was the other woman who caught my attention. She appeared in photo after photo, birthdays, holidays, casual moments around the house. She had Mrs. Whitmore's eyes, but sharper features, and she was always positioned slightly closer to the camera, as if she were the more confident of the two. In the most recent photos, the woman looked tired. Her smile had become strained, and there were dark circles under her eyes. The last few pictures showed her in what looked like a hospital bed, surrounded by flowers and get-well cards. "That's my daughter, Caroline." I spun around to find Mrs. Whitmore standing in the doorway, her face carefully neutral. "I'm sorry," I said, quickly gathering the remaining photos. "I didn't mean to." "It's all right." She entered the room and took the box from my hands. She lived here with me, helped me maintain the place until she trailed off, then seemed to gather herself. "Cancer, last spring." I murmured the appropriate condolences, but Mrs. Whitmore had already turned away, clutching the shoebox against her chest. "Her room was at the end of the hall," she said quietly. "I haven't been able to. The floor really is rotted through in places. I keep meaning to have it repaired." That night, I lay awake listening to the house's nighttime symphony, but underneath the familiar creaks and sighs, there was something new. Footsteps, soft and deliberate, pacing back and forth in the room above mine. Mrs. Whitmore's bedroom was directly below the locked room. Over the next few days, the sounds became more frequent, not just sighing now, but what sounded like furniture being moved, dresser drawers opening and closing, the soft rustle of fabric. Once, I could have sworn I heard humming a wordless melody that seemed familiar, though I couldn't place it. Mrs. Whitmore grew increasingly haggard. She began taking her meals in her room, and when I did see her, she moved through the house like a woman walking underwater. Her hands shook constantly now, and she'd developed a habit of glancing toward the ceiling whenever the sounds grew too pronounced. "Maybe you should consider staying somewhere else for a while," I suggested gently one morning when I found her staring blankly at a cup of coffee that had gone cold. "Just until you can get the repairs done upstairs." She looked at me with such panic that I immediately regretted the suggestion. "No," she said. "No, I can't leave. She's still. This is my home. I've lived here for 40 years. But that evening, she pressed a key into my hand. It was old brass, worn smooth from years of use. "If something happens to me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "if I can't, Just lock the door again. Promise me." I wanted to ask what she meant, but the desperate look in her eyes stopped me. I pocketed the key and promised. 3 days later, I found her at the foot of the stairs. She was still alive when the ambulance arrived, but barely conscious. The paramedics said it looked like she'd fallen, probably sometime during the night. There was a gash on her forehead, and her left arm was bent at an unnatural angle. "Are you family?" one of them asked as they loaded her onto the stretcher. "Just the housekeeper," I said, but I climbed into the ambulance anyway. At the hospital, I sat in a plastic chair and waited for news while Mrs. Whitmore disappeared behind a maze of curtains and medical equipment. The doctors spoke in careful, clinical terms: traumatic brain injury, internal bleeding, guarded prognosis. She might recover, they said, or she might not. Time would tell. I drove back to the house as the sun was setting, unsure of what I was supposed to do. Mrs. Whitmore hadn't mentioned any other family, and I had nowhere else to go. The sensible thing would be to pack my things and leave, find another job, another room somewhere. But the key in my pocket felt heavy, and her desperate words echoed in my mind. The house felt different when I walked through the front door, emptier, but also more tense, like a held breath. I made myself a simple dinner and tried to watch television, but the silence pressed against me from all directions. Around midnight, the sounds started again. Footsteps, but heavier now, more urgent. They paced back and forth above Mrs. Whitmore's room, then stopped directly overhead. I sat frozen on the living room couch, listening to what sounded like someone rearranging furniture, drawers slamming, something being dragged across the floor. Then, silence. I crept upstairs, my heart hammering against my ribs. The hallway was dark, except for the thin line of moonlight seeping under the locked door. As I approached, I could see that the gap at the bottom was no longer empty. Someone was standing just inside the room. I could see the shadow of feet, motionless against the floorboards. As I watched, they shifted slightly, as if the person was turning to face the door. "Mrs. Whitmore?" I whispered, though I knew she was 20 miles away in a hospital bed. The feet moved closer to the door. I could hear breathing now, slow and deliberate, coming from just inches away on the other side of the wood. My hand found the key in my pocket. Mrs. Whitmore's words came back to me. "If something happens to me, if I can't, just lock the door again." But the door was already locked. I pressed my ear against the wood and heard what sounded like fingernails scraping against the other side. Long, slow drags that made my skin crawl. Then, so softly, I almost missed it, a voice. "Mama!" It was weak, confused, like someone waking from a long sleep. "Mama, why won't you come see me?" I stumbled backward, my hands shaking as I fumbled for my phone. No signal, of course. There never was, this far from town. I could drive to the hospital, tell someone what I'd heard, but what would I say? That I'd heard a dead woman calling for her mother? The scratching stopped. In the sudden silence, I could hear my own breathing, ragged and too loud. Then, from behind the door, came the sound of footsteps moving away, slow, shuffling steps that faded into the depths of the room. I spent the rest of the night downstairs, fully dressed, with the car keys in my hand. But I didn't leave. I couldn't shake the image of Mrs. Whitmore's face when I'd suggested she stay somewhere else. The panic, the desperate need to remain in this house with whatever was behind that locked door. In the morning, I called the hospital. Mrs. Whitmore was stable but still unconscious. The doctors couldn't say when she might wake up or if she would. That afternoon, I heard the humming again, the same wordless melody, but clearer now, as if the singer had moved closer to the door. It was beautiful in a heartbreaking way, the kind of song a mother might sing to comfort a frightened child. I found myself standing in the hallway, listening. The humming continued for maybe 10 minutes, then faded to silence. But the silence felt different now, expectant. "Caroline?" I said softly. The temperature in the hallway seemed to drop 10 degrees. My breath came out in visible puffs, and frost began to form on the inside of the nearby windows. "Caroline, your mother is hurt. She's in the hospital." A long pause, then barely audible. "She won't come see me." "She can't. She's unconscious. She fell down the stairs. She's afraid of me." The voice was clearer now, tinged with a sadness so profound it made my chest ache. "She locks me away and pretends I don't exist." I pressed my hand against the door. The wood was ice cold under my palm. "She's grieving," I said. "She lost you, and she doesn't know how to." "I'm not lost." The temperature plummeted further. Ice crystals began forming on the doorknob. "I'm right here. I've always been right here. But she won't look at me. She won't talk to me. Because you're gone, Caroline. You died." A long silence. Then, so quietly, I almost missed it. "I know." The cold began to recede. The frost on the windows melted, leaving trails of water that looked like tears. "But I can't leave," Caroline continued. "Not while she's so sad. Not while she needs me." "She doesn't need you to stay. She needs to let you go." I tried to help her. I tried to make her see that it's okay, that I'm okay. But every time she hears me, she gets more frightened. A pause. Is that why she fell? Because she was running from me. I thought about Mrs. Whitmore's face in those final days, the way she'd flinched at every sound from upstairs, the way she'd clutched that key like a talisman. "Maybe," I admitted. Another long silence. Then, "Will you tell her something for me?" "What?" "Tell her I'm not trapped here. Tell her I chose to stay, but I can choose to leave too, when she's ready." "How will she know when she's ready?" "She'll stop being afraid." The presence behind the door seemed to withdraw, leaving only the familiar creaks and sighs of an old house settling into evening. I stood there for a long time, my hand still pressed against the cold wood, thinking about grief and love and the terrible weight of holding on too tightly. Mrs. Whitmore died 3 days later without regaining consciousness. The funeral was small, a few neighbors, some people from her church, and me. The pastor spoke about reunion and eternal rest, but I found myself thinking about Caroline's voice, sad and patient behind that locked door. The lawyer handling the estate offered to help me find new employment, but there was something I needed to do first. That evening, I returned to the house with the brass key warm in my palm. The hallway was quiet when I reached the top of the stairs. No footsteps, no humming, just the patient silence of a house waiting for someone to make a decision. I slid the key into the lock and turned it. The door opened on a room filled with afternoon sunlight and the smell of dried flowers. It was exactly what Mrs. Whitmore had said: storage space filled with old furniture covered in white sheets, boxes of Christmas decorations, a dress form wearing a wedding gown that had yellowed with age. But in the center of the room, positioned to catch the light from the western window, was a hospital bed. The blankets were pulled up neat and tight, and there were fresh flowers on the nightstand, roses and baby's breath, the kind you'd bring to someone you loved. On the pillow was a photograph, Mrs. Whitmore and Caroline, both young, both smiling, both very much alive. I I stood there for a long time, understanding finally what Mrs. Whitmore had been unable to tell me. Caroline hadn't been haunting this room. She'd been visiting it, keeping vigil over the shrine her mother had built to their shared grief. When I left the house that evening, I didn't lock the door behind me. Some rooms aren't meant to stay closed forever. The real estate agent said the house sold quickly to a young family from Boston. They're planning to renovate, turn it into the kind of bright, modern home where children can grow up safely. I hope they keep the room at the end of the hall open. I hope they fill it with laughter and toys, and all the sounds of a life fully lived. Sometimes, late at night in my new apartment across town, I think I can still hear that wordless humming, but it sounds different now. Not sad or trapped, but free, fading into the distance like a song carried on the wind. I like to think Caroline found what she was looking for. I like to think they both did. Story 5. The radio plays a station that shouldn't exist. The antique radio came with the apartment, sitting on a dusty shelf between water-stained paperbacks and a dead spider plant. The landlord had waved dismissively when I'd asked about it during the walkthrough. Previous tenants' junk. Keep it, toss it, whatever. It was one of those old Philco cathedral models from the 1940s, its walnut veneer scarred, but still beautiful, with ivory-colored knobs and a fabric speaker grille that looked like it had once been cream, but had faded to the color of old bone. The apartment was a studio on the third floor of a converted Victorian in Albany, the kind of place you rent when you're 26 and starting over after a relationship implodes. The windows faced an alley, the refrigerator hummed like a dying animal, and the radiator clanged all night during the October cold snap, but it was mine, and after 3 months of sleeping on friends' couches, mine was enough. I'd been living there for 2 weeks before I bothered plugging in the radio. Insomnia had become my constant companion since the breakup, and the silence of the empty apartment felt oppressive during those long hours between midnight and dawn. I figured some background noise might help late night talk radio or soft jazz, something to fill the spaces between my racing thoughts. The radio crackled to life with surprising clarity, considering its age. I turned the dial slowly, fishing for stations through waves of static. Most of what I found was exactly what you'd expect for upstate New York at 2 in the morning. Evangelical programming, oldies, stations, the occasional college radio show playing experimental noise that sounded like someone torturing a synthesizer. But at 88.1 FM, right between the classical station and the college broadcaster, I found something different. And that concludes our evening weather report. Currently 17 degrees with light snow expected before dawn. This is WKBR, broadcasting from the heart of Millbrook, where every day is a gift and every night brings us closer to tomorrow. The voice was warm and reassuring, with the practiced cadence of someone who'd been doing radio for decades. There was something comforting about it, the kind of voice that belonged to late-night conversations and shared secrets. I settled back into my second-hand armchair and let the sound wash over me. Up next, we have a special request from Eleanor out on Maple Street. She'd like to dedicate Blue Moon to her late husband, Charles, on what would have been their 52nd wedding anniversary. Eleanor, honey, we know he's listening. The song that followed was a version I'd never heard before, not the familiar Sinatra recording or the doo-wop classic, but something older, more intimate. The singer's voice was tinged with a sadness that seemed to seep through the radio's aging speakers and settle in my chest like a physical weight. I checked my phone to see if I could find any information about WKBR. The search results were strange references to a station that had apparently operated in the Millbrook area from 1952 to 1987, when it had gone off the air after the owner's death. But that couldn't be right. I was clearly listening to it now, and the programming sounded contemporary enough. Maybe it had been revived, I reasoned. Small towns were always trying to bring back local institutions. The FCC database would have more current information, but my laptop was in the bedroom, and I didn't want to disturb the peaceful atmosphere the station was creating. That was Billy Harrington with Blue Moon, a beautiful song for a beautiful love story. Eleanor, we hope that brought you some comfort tonight. The DJ's voice returned, smooth as aged whiskey. Now, I've got a message here from someone new to our listening family. They didn't leave a name, but they wanted us to know they're having trouble sleeping in their new place. Well, friend, you've come to the right station. We specialize in helping folks find their way through the long, dark hours. My blood went cold. I looked around the empty apartment, suddenly aware of how alone I was. The message couldn't be about me. I hadn't contacted any radio station. It had to be a coincidence, the kind of generic dedication that could apply to anyone. But then the DJ continued. Our new listener is dealing with some changes, some heartbreak. 3rd floor apartment, old building, feeling a little lost in the shuffle of starting over. We've all been there, haven't we? Sometimes when life pulls the rug out from under us, we need a friendly voice to remind us that we're not as alone as we think. The coincidences were piling up too neatly. 3rd floor apartment, old building, starting over. I reached for the radio's volume dial, but hesitated. Despite the creeping unease, there was something magnetic about the voice, something that made me want to keep listening. I'm going to play something special for you, friend. This one always helps me when the walls feel like they're closing in. The song was Summertime, but again, not any version I recognized. The arrangement was sparse just piano and vocal sand. There was a quality to the recording that made it sound like it was being performed live in the room with me. I could hear the soft creak of the piano bench, the barely audible intake of breath before each phrase. I must have dozed off in the chair, because the next thing I knew, weak morning light was filtering through the alley-facing windows, and the radio was playing static. I fumbled for the dial, but 88.1 yielded nothing but white noise. The other stations came through clearly enough: morning news, pop music, traffic reports for the Albany metro area. But WKBR had vanished, as if it had never existed. Over the next few nights, I developed a routine. I'd plug in the radio around midnight and scan for the station, which always seemed to appear at 88.1 right around the same time. The programming was consistent, a mixture of music from the 40s and 50s, local weather and community announcements from Millbrook, and the soothing voice of the unnamed DJ, who seemed to know exactly what his listeners needed to hear. The more I listened, the more questions I had. The weather reports matched what I was seeing outside my Albany windows, but Millbrook was over an hour away. The community announcements referenced local businesses and events, but when I tried to verify them online, I found either outdated information or no information at all. Miller's Hardware, which the DJ mentioned in a sponsor spot, had apparently closed in 1989. The Millbrook Community Center, where he encouraged listeners to attend the monthly dance, had been demolished in the early 2000s. But the most unsettling aspect was how personal the show seemed to become. Night after night, the DJ would make comments that felt specifically directed at me. He'd mention the sleepless nights, the career uncertainty, the way the radiator in old buildings could sound like ghosts in the walls. Once, he played a song that had been special to my ex-girlfriend and me, prefacing it with, This one's for everyone who's wondering if they made the right choice. Sometimes love isn't enough, and that's nobody's fault. I started keeping a notebook, documenting the strange coincidences and impossible details. The dates on the community announcements didn't make sense. Harvest festivals in winter, ice fishing tournaments in what should have been spring. The DJ would reference current events, but always slightly wrong, as if he were remembering them imperfectly or reporting from a parallel timeline where history had unfolded differently. President Reagan's visit to Albany went well this week. He announced one night in late October, though I hear there was some concern about the protesters downtown. Folks have strong opinions about foreign policy these days. Reagan had been dead for years, but the DJ's tone was matter-of-fact, as if he were reporting yesterday's news. I tried calling the station during the day, using the phone number provided in the evening sign-off. The number was disconnected. I drove to Millbrook on a Saturday afternoon, looking for any sign of WKBR's broadcast facilities. The address listed in my online research led to an empty lot overgrown with weeds and scattered with the concrete foundations of a building that had been demolished long ago. But I kept listening, despite the growing certainty that something was deeply wrong with WKBR. I found myself looking forward to those midnight hours when the station would flicker to life. The DJ's voice had become a comfort, a familiar presence in the isolating landscape of my new life. When insomnia struck, which was most nights, she was there with exactly the right song, the perfect words of encouragement, the sense that someone, somewhere, understood what I was going through. Loneliness is a funny thing, he said one night in early November. It can make us see things that aren't there, hear things that don't exist. But sometimes what we call imagination is just our hearts reaching out for connection. Sometimes the things that shouldn't exist are the things we need most. The statement hung in the air like a challenge. I stared at the radio, its warm glow the only light in the dark apartment, and felt something shift in the atmosphere around me. The temperature seemed to drop, and I could have sworn I smelled something: cigarette smoke and coffee, the distinctive scent of an old recording studio. You've been doing some research on us, haven't you, friend? The DJ's voice was gentler now, almost paternal, looking up addresses, checking records, trying to make sense of something that doesn't want to make sense. I reached for the radio to turn it off, but my hand stopped inches from the dial. I needed to hear what came next. The thing is, existence isn't as simple as being alive or being dead, being real or being imaginary. Sometimes we exist in the spaces between, in the frequencies that shouldn't carry signals, in the hours that fall through the cracks of normal time. We exist because someone needs us to exist. The signal began to fade, wavering in and out like a weak AM station during a thunderstorm. Through the static, I could still hear the DJ's voice, but it was becoming more distant, as if he were speaking from the bottom of a well. WKBR has been broadcasting from Millbrook for 37 years, friend. 37 years of late-night companionship for folks who can't sleep, who need a friendly voice in the darkness. We went off the air in 1987 when our owner, Jack Morrison, passed away from a heart attack right here in the studio during the overnight shift. But somehow, we kept broadcasting. Somehow, we found a way to keep reaching the people who needed us most. The static was overwhelming now, but I pressed my ear to the speaker, straining to catch every word. We're not trapped here, friend. We're not haunting anyone. We chose to stay because this work bringing comfort to the lonely, companionship to the isolated. This work isn't finished just because our bodies gave out. Death is just another country, and radio waves don't respect borders. The signal cleared for a moment, and the DJ's voice came through with perfect clarity one last time. "You're going to be okay, friend. The heartbreak will fade, the insomnia will pass, and eventually you won't need us anymore. When that happens, you won't be able to find 88.1 no matter how hard you try. But until then, we'll be here every night from midnight till dawn, playing the songs you need to hear and reminding you that you're never as alone as you think." The static returned, and then silence. I sat in the dark apartment for a long time, staring at the radio's glowing dial. When I finally worked up the courage to try tuning to 88.1 again, there was nothing there but empty frequency. Over the following weeks, my sleep gradually improved. The career uncertainty began to resolve itself, and the sharp edges of heartbreak started to blur into something more manageable. I found myself reaching for the radio less frequently, and when I did, 88.1 would yield nothing but static. By December, I had stopped looking for WKBR entirely. The radio sat silently on its shelf, gathering dust between the books and the dead plant. I bought a new sound machine for white noise and subscribed to a meditation app. Life moved forward as it always does. But sometimes, usually during the first few minutes after midnight, I'd catch myself listening for something in the quiet apartment. A familiar voice, a distant song, the comforting static of a signal reaching out across impossible distances. And once, just once, I could have sworn I heard it faint as a whisper, warm as a friend's hand on your shoulder. This is WKBR, broadcasting from the heart of Millbrook, where every day is a gift and every night brings us closer to tomorrow. I never tried to tune in the radio again. Some connections are too precious to test, too fragile to examine too closely. But I kept it, that old Philco cathedral model, sitting on its shelf like a shrine to the impossible kindness of strangers who exist in the spaces between frequencies, offering comfort to anyone brave enough to listen in the dark. The new tenant who took over my lease probably threw it away. People don't have much use for antique radios anymore, and most of them wouldn't know how to find a station that broadcasts from nowhere, playing songs for an audience of insomniacs and the heartbroken. But I hope whoever lives there now has better luck sleeping than I did. I hope they never need to go searching through the static for a voice that understands what it means to be alone at 3 in the morning. And if they do, I hope they find 88.1. I hope Jack Morrison is still there, still broadcasting from the heart of a town that may or may not exist, still playing the perfect song for whoever needs to hear it most. Some kinds of magic are too important to die, even when the people who create them have moved on to whatever comes next. The radio plays a station that shouldn't exist, but sometimes the things that shouldn't exist are the things that matter most. Story 6, The Face in Frame 13. The estate sale was winding down when you found the portrait. Most of the good pieces had been claimed by early morning buyers, the antique furniture, the silver tea service, the first edition books that had filled the library of the old Blackwood mansion. You'd arrived late, hoping for overlooked treasures among the dregs, and found instead a hallway lined with portraits that no one seemed to want. They were good paintings, oil on canvas, dating from different periods over the past 2 centuries. Family portraits mostly, formal poses of stern-faced ancestors dressed in the fashions of their respective eras. The auction house had priced them to move, clearly eager to clear out the mansion before the demolition crew arrived next week. But it was the 13th portrait that caught your attention. The painting depicted a woman in her 30s, dressed in a dark Victorian gown that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Her face was pale, almost luminous against the somber background, with dark eyes that seemed to follow your movement down the hallway. The artist had captured something in her expression, not quite sadness, not quite anger, but a kind of watchful waiting that made you pause mid-step. The placard beneath read, "Portrait of Elena Blackwood, 1847, 1863, artist unknown. 16 years old when she died." You did the math automatically, struck by how young she'd been. The painting showed her as a woman, not a girl, but there was something timeless about her face that could have belonged to any age. "Interesting choice," said the estate sale coordinator, appearing at your elbow with practiced stealth. "That one's been here all 3 days." "Remarkable piece, but," she shrugged, "people get uncomfortable with portraits of the deceased." "What happened to her?" "Elena? Family records are spotty, but the story goes she died in some kind of accident. Fall down the stairs, I think. Or maybe it was consumption that was common enough in those days." Anyway, beautiful work. The artist really captured something special. You bought it for $50, which seemed like theft for a painting of that quality. The coordinator seemed relieved to see it go, helping you carry it to your car with unusual enthusiasm for someone whose job was to retain inventory. Your apartment building had an old-fashioned hallway, hardwood floors, high ceilings, wallpaper that had probably been fashionable sometime in the 1970s. The portrait fit perfectly on the wall opposite your door, where the light from the hallway window would illuminate it during the day. Elena Blackwood took up residence in your daily routine immediately. You'd catch glimpses of her as you left for work in the morning, her dark eyes seeming to assess your choice of outfit or the hurried way you grabbed your keys. Coming home in the evening, you'd nod to her in acknowledgement, the way you might greet a neighbor. It was silly, of course, but living alone in the city could be isolating, and having Elena's painted presence in the hallway made the space feel less empty. She was beautiful in an austere 19th century way, and her expression held a gravity that suggested she'd taken her role as family observer seriously. The first change was so subtle you almost missed it. You'd been living with the portrait for about a week when something nagged at you during your morning coffee routine. You found yourself studying Elena's face, trying to identify what felt different. Her position was the same, three-quarter profile, hands folded, dark dress unchanged. But something about her expression seemed softer, somehow, less severe than you remembered. You chalked it up to changing light conditions. Old paintings could look remarkably different depending on the time of day, the weather, the angle of observation. Oil paints had depth that could create optical illusions, make faces seem to shift mood with the viewer's perspective. But over the following days, the changes became more pronounced. Elena's mouth, which had been set in a thin, disapproving line, now held the faintest suggestion of a smile. Not happiness exactly, but a warmth that hadn't been there before. Her eyes, while still following your movement through the hallway, seemed less judgmental and more curious. You started paying closer attention, making mental notes of Elena's appearance each morning and evening. The changes were always small, always gradual, but definitely real. Her head had turned slightly more toward the viewer. Her hands had shifted position, fingers more relaxed. Even her posture seemed less rigid, as if she was settling into a more comfortable pose. It was impossible, of course. Oil paintings didn't change over the course of weeks, let alone days. But impossible or not, Elena Blackwood was becoming more animated with each passing day. You considered the practical explanations first. Temperature fluctuations could cause canvas to expand and contract, potentially altering the way paint reflected light. Humidity might affect the surface texture. Maybe the painting had been poorly restored at some point, and environmental factors were causing previous work to show through. But none of those theories explain the systematic nature of the changes. Elena wasn't randomly shifting. She was moving with purpose, as if slowly turning to face something that hadn't been there before. 2 weeks after buying the portrait, you came home to find Elena looking directly out of the frame. Not the three-quarter profile she'd maintained since 1847, but a full frontal pose that seemed to study you with unconcealed interest. Her smile was more pronounced now, almost conspiratorial, as if she was pleased to have finally captured your full attention. You stood in the hallway staring at her, your keys forgotten in your hand, trying to reconcile what you were seeing with what you knew to be possible. The painting was definitely the same frame, same canvas, same signature in the bottom right corner. But Elena had moved from a classical portrait pose to something more intimate, more immediate. That night, you found yourself unable to concentrate on anything else. You kept finding excuses to walk through the hallway, ostensibly heading to the kitchen or bathroom, but really just checking on Elena. Each time, she was exactly as you'd left her, facing forward, smiling slightly, watching. But there was something in her eyes now that made you uncomfortable. Not malevolence exactly, but an intensity that seemed disproportionate to her circumstances. She was, after all, just paint on canvas. But she looked at you with the focused attention of someone who had been waiting a very long time for something specific to happen. You tried researching Elena Blackwood online, but found almost nothing. The Blackwood family had been prominent in the region during the 19th century, industrialists who'd made their fortune in textiles and railroad investments. But individual family members, particularly the women, had left little trace in historical records. The one exception was a brief mention in a local historical society newsletter from 1963, commemorating the centennial of Elena's death. According to the article, she'd been found at the bottom of the mansion's main staircase on a winter morning in 1863. The family had claimed it was an accident, but there had been speculation at the time about suicide or even murder. The article included a single photograph of Elena's portrait taken in the mansion's original location. You compared it to the painting now hanging in your hallway, and the difference was striking. In the historical photograph, Elena was clearly in profile, her expression severe and remote. Nothing like the frontal pose and subtle smile that had developed over the past 2 weeks. That's when you realized you weren't dealing with a gradually changing painting. You were watching someone wake up. The transformation accelerated after that. Elena's smile became more pronounced, more knowing. Her eyes began to track your movement, not just across the hallway, but through the apartment, as if she could see through walls. Sometimes you'd catch her looking toward your bedroom or kitchen, her expression thoughtful, as if she was learning the layout of your life. More disturbing were the moments when you'd find her looking toward the apartment's front door, her face expectant, as if she was waiting for someone to arrive. During those times, her smile would fade into something more complex, anticipation mixed with what might have been hunger. You started avoiding the hallway when possible, using the back entrance to your apartment building, taking longer routes to the kitchen and bathroom. But Elena's presence filled the space even when you couldn't see her. You'd feel watched, evaluated, as if someone was taking inventory of your habits and finding them either amusing or inadequate. 3 weeks after bringing the portrait home, you woke to find your apartment door standing open. Not just unlocked, fully open, revealing the empty hallway beyond. You were certain you'd locked it the night before. You always locked it, living alone in the city. But there it was, open to anyone who might have been wandering the halls at 3 a.m. As you got up to close it, you glanced at Elena's portrait and froze. She was no longer looking out of the frame. Instead, she was turned toward the open doorway, her expression bright with anticipation, as if she'd been expecting this moment. And for the first time since you'd brought her home, Elena's mouth was open slightly, as if she was about to speak. You slammed the door and triple-checked the locks, but sleep was impossible after that. You spent the rest of the night sitting in your living room, afraid to look toward the hallway but unable to stop listening for sounds that shouldn't be there. Footsteps, whispers, the rustle of 19th century fabric. The next morning, Elena was back to her usual frontal pose, smiling serenely as if nothing had happened. But there was something different about the quality of her attention now. She no longer seemed to be simply watching. She was studying, planning, preparing for something. That evening, you found a note on your kitchen counter, written in elegant 19th century script. "Thank you for bringing me home, E." Your hand shook as you held the paper. The ink was fresh, still slightly wet, but there was no one else in the apartment. No way anyone could have entered without your knowledge. The handwriting was feminine, educated, exactly what you'd expect from a well-bred woman of Elena's era. You confronted the portrait directly that night, standing in the hallway and speaking to Elena as if she could hear you. "What do you want?" you asked the painted face. Elena's smile widened almost imperceptibly, and her eyes seemed to brighten with approval, but she offered no verbal response, no additional notes. Just that knowing look that suggested she was pleased to finally have your full attention. Over the following days, the interactions became more frequent. You'd find objects moved slightly from where you'd left them, a book turned to a different page, a coffee cup repositioned on the counter, clothes rearranged in your closet. Nothing dramatic, nothing that couldn't be explained by ordinary forgetfulness, but the pattern was clear. Elena was exploring your life, learning about the 21st century through your possessions, and she was getting stronger, more capable of affecting the physical world around her. The breakthrough came during your 4th week with the portrait. You returned from work to find Elena facing away from the viewer for the first time, her painted form turned toward the wall as if she was looking at something behind the canvas. Her posture suggested intense concentration, and there was something about the set of her shoulders that reminded you of someone preparing for a difficult task. That night, you dreamed of the Blackwood mansion as it had been in Elena's time. Grand rooms filled with heavy furniture, long hallways lined with family portraits, a massive staircase leading to the upper floors. In the dream, you walked those hallways as Elena had, wearing the dark dress from the portrait, feeling the weight of expectations and restrictions that had defined a young woman's life in the 1840s. But there was something else in the dream, a sense of growing frustration, of a mind too quick and curious for the limitations placed upon it. Elena had been intelligent, educated, ambitious in ways that her era couldn't accommodate. She chafed against the boundaries of her prescribed role, sought knowledge and experiences that were deemed inappropriate for women of her class. And she'd found them, somehow. Late-night reading in the library, correspondence with scholars and artists, experiments with ideas that would have scandalized polite society. Elena had been living a secret intellectual life, pursuing interests that could have ruined her family's reputation if discovered. You woke with the absolute certainty that Elena's death hadn't been an accident. She'd been pushed down those stairs by someone who'd discovered her unconventional pursuits, someone who'd seen her curiosity as a threat to the established order. But death hadn't ended Elena's quest for knowledge. It had only changed the parameters. Trapped in the portrait, she'd spent more than a century and a half observing, learning, waiting for the opportunity to expand her understanding beyond the confines of painted canvas. And now, through your inadvertent invitation, she'd found a way to step back into the world. The final transformation happened while you slept. You woke to find the portrait completely empty, not Elena turned away or hidden in shadow, but genuinely absent. The frame contained only the painted background, dark curtains, ornate furniture, the suggestion of a room that had once been occupied. But Elena herself was gone. You found her in your bathroom mirror, not a reflection. You were looking directly at the glass, and Elena was looking back. She wore the same dark Victorian dress, had the same pale, luminous skin, but now she existed in the silvered surface of your mirror rather than oil paint on canvas. She smiled when she saw you notice her, and this time her mouth moved with words you could hear clearly. "Thank you for the invitation. I've learned so much from watching you." Her voice carried the precise diction of educated 19th century speech, but there was something else underneath it, a hunger for experience that a century and a half of observation had only intensified. "I've been so very curious about your world," Elena continued, her reflection moving independently in the mirror. "The books you read, the devices you use, the freedom you have to move through the world as you choose. I want to understand it all." You tried to speak but found your voice caught in your throat. Elena's smile became more sympathetic, more understanding. "Don't be afraid. I'm not here to harm you. Quite the opposite. I'm here to learn from you, to experience through you what I was denied in my own time." As she spoke, you began to feel a strange lethargy, as if your energy was being slowly drained away. Your reflection in the mirror grew fainter while Elena's became more solid, more present. "The wonderful thing about mirrors," Elena said conversationally, "is that they show truth. They reflect what is, not what we pretend to be. And the truth is, you've been as trapped in your life as I was in my portrait, going through the motions, existing without truly living. Your legs felt weak, and you had to grip the bathroom counter to stay upright. In the mirror, Elena was becoming more three-dimensional, more real, while your own reflection seemed to flatten and fade. "But I can change that," Elena continued, her voice growing stronger as yours grew weaker. "I can take the limitations of your life and transform them into possibilities. I can use your freedom to explore everything I was denied, and in return, you can rest. You can step back from the exhausting business of being alive and simply observe." You understood then what was happening. Elena wasn't trying to possess you in any violent, demonic sense. She was offering an exchange, your life for hers, your freedom for her curiosity. She would take your place in the 21st century, and you would take hers in the reflective surfaces that had become her domain. As consciousness faded, your last clear thought was a recognition of the elegant justice in Elena's plan. She'd spent over a century watching life through painted eyes, learning about humanity from a distance. Now she would experience it directly, and you would take your turn as observer. When you wake up, you're looking out from the bathroom mirror. The world looks different from this side of the glass, flattened, reversed, but somehow more honest. You can see Elena in your body, examining your hands with wonder, touching your face with fascination, marveling at the sensation of breath-filling lungs that had been still for more than a century. She catches sight of you in the mirror and smiles with genuine warmth. "Thank you," she says, and her voice sounds strange coming from your throat. "I promise to make good use of this opportunity." And she does. Through the various mirrors and reflective surfaces in your apartment, You watch Elena explore your life with the enthusiasm of someone who has been denied sensory experience for too long. She reads your books with delight, experiments with your technology with scientific curiosity, even orders takeout food just to experience the taste of something other than memory. But it's the outside world that truly captivates her. Through windows and storefront glass, you watch Elena venture into the city with the wonder of a 19th century woman encountering the 21st century for the first time. She rides elevators like they're magic carriages, stares at smartphones like miraculous artifacts, approaches every new experience with the hunger of someone making up for lost time. You should be angry, should feel violated by this theft of your life, but instead you find yourself oddly content. Elena was right. You had been going through the motions, existing without truly living. Watching her experience your world with such joy and curiosity makes you see it differently, appreciate aspects you've taken for granted, and there are compensations to your new existence. You can move between any reflective surface, observing the world from angles that were impossible when you were bound to a single physical form. You see things others miss, understand connections that weren't visible from a linear perspective. Sometimes Elena talks to you through the mirrors, sharing her discoveries and asking questions about your world. She's particularly fascinated by the freedom you possessed as a modern woman, the ability to travel alone, to pursue any career, to speak your mind without fear of social destruction. I dreamed of such possibilities, she tells you one evening, your reflection meeting hers in the bedroom mirror, but I never imagined they would be real. Months pass. Elena settles into your life with increasing confidence, making it her own while honoring its basic structure. She keeps your job, though she approaches it with an intellectual passion that impresses your colleagues. She maintains your friendships, though she brings a 19th century formality to interactions that people find charming rather than strange. And slowly, you begin to understand that this isn't permanent. Elena's hunger for experience is vast, but not infinite. She's working through a century and a half of curiosity, tasting everything your world has to offer, but eventually that appetite will be satisfied. When that day comes, she'll have a choice to make. She could keep your life, hold on to the freedom and possibilities she's discovered, or she could return what she borrowed, step back into the reflective realm and let you reclaim your existence. You think you know which choice she'll make. Elena Blackwood was many things, curious, ambitious, perhaps even ruthless in pursuit of knowledge, but she was also fundamentally fair. She'd made a bargain, offered in exchange, and she would honor the terms of that agreement. Until then, you wait and watch and learn. You see your life reflected through someone else's eyes, understand its value in ways you never did when it was simply yours. And sometimes, late at night, when Elena stands before the bathroom mirror brushing teeth that were once yours, you find yourself smiling at the strange gift she's given you, the opportunity to see yourself clearly, perhaps for the first time. After all, mirrors never lie. They only show us truths we weren't ready to see. Tonight's whispers end here. If your eyes are still open, don't turn around. Let the dark take care of everything. Sleep well.